we go. Right then, hello everyone. Everyone that's joined us live today, thanks for joining us. Anyone that's watching us back on YouTube, again, thanks for the view. If you like what you see, please rate the videos. Subscription would be awesome. Like the videos, it really helps us decide on what content to look for and what to do next. So today I'd like to talk about thinning paints for airbrushing. So as many of you will be aware, there's hundreds of different paint ranges for what we're using in the hobby. The ones that we airbrush tend to be water based. The Games Workshop paints are pretty good. They will go through an airbrush, although they're a little bit more challenging to get into the cup. I like the Vallejo paints predominantly because there's a fantastic colour range and they come in a dropper bottle, so and it just makes putting stuff in the airbrush a lot easier. So what I'd like to cover off today, I've got a little bit of a project on the desk at the moment. I want to airbrush a heat bloom onto the end of my gun barrels, which affords us a good opportunity because I use a Citadel base colour paint. I use a couple of model colour paints and then a model air colour paint. So 3 different consistencies of paint to have a look at putting through the airbrush. So I think the best thing to do is just get stuck in, really. I think this is how I do it. I think there's 101 different ways to do it out there, and by no means is mine the correct way. If you find a better way, please share it with the rest of the channel, because that would be awesome. Today I'm going to be using my Badger Renegade Chrome. It has a 0.2 needle in it, so I've just put my quick release coupling on. Those of you that watched my beginner's guide to airbrushing will have seen me talk about those. I've got here on the desk some weapons for an Invictus suit that I'm working on. There's a flame thing here. So these will have been undercoated black and base coated just with a silver paint. So the colour I'm going to start with is Vallejo model colour brass. It is a metallic colour, but we're doing such a little amount of it, putting it through the smaller airbrush isn't going to be too much of an issue. So with it being in a dropper bottle, I'm going to use one technique that most people will use. I'm going to thin this with some Vallejo airbrush thinner, if I can just get it in the shot there, or maybe even that one might be better. There we go. So what I'm going to do now is, because the model colour range is quite thick, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple of drops in the bottom of my cup, so it just covers the needle. If I'm looking in the bottom of my cup, I've just covering the needle there. So I've given my paint a bit of a shake before the video. Actually, I will just give it another bit of a shake there, and then I'm just going to put a couple of drops in the top. 1, 2, 3 should be enough, and you can see it's quite thick and it's gone straight to the bottom of the cup. Okay, so I'm just going to get a normal brush, and I'm just going to give that a little bit of a mix up. Okay, so we can see now I'm just giving it a good mix, and now it's mixed with the airbrush thinner. I'm just pulling it up the side of the cup. I'm just going to see if I can show you guys that a little bit better. No, no, I can't. So, now what's that like? No, you can't see that. So okay, so basically what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the consistency of this paint. So and I would like it to be like milk. So, and I'm just doing it in the top of the cup and just twisting it just like that. Nothing fancy, nothing difficult, nothing hard. But I've looked at that and I'm thinking that's a little bit thin. And if I was to blow it through the airbrush now, I'll try if I can show you on this piece of paper. You'll see. Do you see how it's spidered on the paper? I'm just wondering if I should show you that even closer. So you see how it's spidered. Okay, so that's our indication that the paint in the cup is too thin. It's too much like water. So it's an easy fix. We just put a little bit more paint in. So I'm going to put another couple of drops in. Now people will tell you all sorts of things, that you need to work at 3 drops of paint to 2 drops of thinner, or vice versa. Now I don't believe in saying things like that, because if you're anything like me, you could have 101 paints on your paint desk and you might not use that paint again for weeks, and it might dry out a little bit, so the consistency changes. So that in my eyes there is no hard and fast rule for thinning, other than looking for the consistency and how the paint goes through the brush. So, which is why I always airbrush with a piece of paper underneath, because I like to test what we're doing. So now I've given that a mix. We can see now that it's coming through the airbrush. It's still a little bit watery. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. I'll pull that in a bit closer, this top camera. So you can see that it's still just pushing the paint up. So that's telling me that I'm still a little bit too thin, which is surprising me actually with this brassy colour, because it is quite a thick paint. So I'm just going to give that another 2 little squirts, 2 little drops of the paint. And again, this is a great use for the dropper bottles, because you can just drop a little bit more in, drop a little bit more in. Now I can already see in this cup now, if I pull that down, we're much more like the consistency of milk. So I'm quite confident this time that when I test it, I'm going to be quite happy with that. Or certainly for this little job that I'm doing here. So again, I'm just going to go down to my piece of paper. I'm putting that, when I'm pulling the trigger, I'm putting the air on, so my air's on constantly, and then I just draw back the trigger to allow the paint and the needle to flow through. So I'm quite happy with that. It is still a little bit watery, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to correct that by putting a bit of distance between the airbrush and the piece that I want to paint. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to airbrush a nice little band of this brass colour around the model here. So I'm keeping it quite a distance from the airbrush, because I am aware that I haven't quite thinned this to the consistency where I can airbrush really tight up close to the model. You know, obviously some of that could also be the fact that it's a metallic colour. But again, thinning the paint isn't just the only control over the airbrush we've got. You see, we've got the distance from the nozzle of the brush to the item that we're trying to paint, and we've got the amount of trigger control that we're using. And you see, I'm just sort of, what I was doing there was just sort of dotting it so that the air from the airbrush dries the paint as it's been applied. So it's another way of us sort of getting round that when our paint is a little bit thinner than what we want. Again, I'm just gonna crack on and do these because I didn't want to do a mix and not do something useful with it, so I'm just gonna carry on. So I'm just gonna carry on with this for a second, and you'll probably hear that I'm just sort of pulsing the air on the airbrush. Just gives us a little control. I'm trying to get a nice sort of feathered look on this brass. It's the first stage of the heat bloom effect that I'm trying to achieve. I'm quite happy with that. He says, fumbling around. Do a little bit more on the top there. So this stage of the heat bloom effect, I suppose I best explain what I'm doing on that. So I've got a brassy colour. I'm going to then go to a purple colour, to a blue colour, and finish off with a black right on the tips of the barrels. The idea being to try and create a heat distorted metal look, to simulate the fact that these barrels of the guns have been pumping out bullet after bullet after bullet. Hopefully bringing a swift end to the enemies of the Emperor. So there we go. I'm just pulsing this trigger, and I haven't done anything overly complicated. It's relatively straightforward. There we go. I'm going to say I actually quite enjoyed doing this Invictus suit. It lends itself to airbrushing quite well. I've sort of built up various subcomponents that I'm sort of working on a little bit at a time. And so far so good. It's coming together fairly well. So you can see I've actually made a bit of a mistake there, and I've blobbed up a bit of paint, but you can just wipe it off with your finger and just have another go. That's the beauty with the airbrush, is that you put such a thin layer of paint on, there's always a bit of a way out. You can either cover it up or respray it, various ways round. So I'm just going to clean my airbrush out. So those of you that saw my other video, I've got a little pot over here. I'll just stick my airbrush in, and I'm just going to empty out what paint I have in the top of the airbrush. I'm just going to do what I call a colour change clean down. So I've just used a bit of my airbrush cleaner. That's actually airbrush cleaner thinned down with a bit of water. Just because I'm a tight Yorkshireman, I like to make things go a little bit further. So I'm using the same brush I used to mix it up, just to rinse out, rub the paint out of the cup and around the bottom of the needle. give the tip a bit of a wipe, and blast that into my cleaner. So that should, and you can see relatively clean my cup. Too unduly worried because the next colour that we're going to use is going to blend into the idea is that will blend into the colour that I've just done. So I aren't too worried if the cup isn't crystal clean and pristine. But what I do want to make sure I've got is that I've got all the airbrush cleaner out of the tool, because that will also thin our paint. So to do that, I just put my hand on under there, and I'm just making sure I feel just air and no moisture coming through the brush. So now I've got my airbrush back to the state, I'm ready to do the next colour. So again, the next colour is this model colour violet. That's what I'm going to use. I'm going to give it a bit of a shake. Whee! Okay. I'm going to use the same method of thinning. So I'm going to go back to the airbrush thinners. I'm going to put the airbrush thinner in first. So, and I suppose this goes back to my sprayer training days. Qualified agricultural sprayer, and they always taught us on out that course to put our water in the tank first before the chemical. And I think the same applies to the airbrushing. We put the thinner in and then put the paint into the thinner and mix it. I just think it mixes better from my experience. So again, I put my paint in. I'm using the dropper bottles again, so I'm just going to put a couple of drops of paint in. So you'll immediately notice that this paint's a lot thinner, and I'm immediately regretting putting all that thinner in, because if I go down here now, look what happens. We get that horrible spidering straight away, which means I'm going to, off camera I guess, unless I turn my camera that way. No, you don't want to look at my crotch. There we go. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pour some of that out. This is what I like about live videos. You guys get to see me making mistakes. So what I've done there is I've just poured at the excess airbrush thinner out, and I've gone back to the cup, and I will find my brush. I'm just gonna give that another look, and then I'm pulling it up the side of the cup just to see that I've got that consistency of milk that we're looking for. Okay. What you can sometimes find is the paint will be heavier than the thinner, and it will sink to the bottom of the cup. So it'll look quite watery towards the top of the cup, but it'll be real thick paint at the bottom, and we need to make sure that we mix that up, that thick paint that's at the bottom of the cup, into the thinners before we actually try pulling the trigger and pulling the air out. Otherwise what will happen is it'll blow thick paint down the needle, and it'll potentially block the needle up. But now you can see how I've dealt with a situation where we've had too much thinners in the cup. So I've poured a little bit of the thinners out. We've just had a bit of a remix, and I can see now I'm getting a real nice even pattern on the airbrush. So I'm quite happy now to go back to my little project that I was working on over here. And you don't need much drying time on the paint from an airbrush, because as I mentioned earlier, we're only putting on thin coats. So what I'm going to do, I'm for my heat bloom effect. I'm going to come back and I'm going to try leave some of the brass colour showing and get this purpley colour next to it. And again, I'm controlling the airbrush the same way as I did earlier. You'll notice that sometimes I take the airbrush off the project and I aim it at the piece of paper, and what I'm doing is I'm actually feeling through the trigger of the airbrush a build-up of paint on the needle that could potentially cause us a bit of a splattering effect on our model. So I take that and I just give a good blast on a piece of paper that's not so important, and it just allows us, so you can start to see the build up of the colours. I've gone from the brass, I've tried to transition into the purple, and that's what we're doing there. Those of you out there that ride motorcycles that have big stainless steel exhausts, you'll see this effect on there on your bikes. And again, you're not forced to use these colours. You could throw some greens in there, some blues. Sky's the limit. The heat distortions take lots of different colours. Okay. There's 2 out of 4 done. You can see I'm not pulling the trigger for any great length of time. The air is going through the airbrush more than the paint is, you know. And again, you can also use that air to dry the piece you're working on. So for argument's sake, say you just had one of these instead of 4 to do, you could use the air from the airbrush to dry the piece. So we are working on a small area, so if you're new to airbrushing, I'd maybe have a bit of practice, sort of target practice as it were. And that's, again, you can do that quite easily. You know, if you take a piece of paper, mark a cross on it, a couple of crosses on, you know, you can use that as a bit of a target, and you can sort of think, right, I'm going to try and get in the middle of that cross, you know, and do a couple of those maybe before you start airbrushing. I'm sure you wouldn't have too much trouble. So there we have it. There we have the second colour that's gone on. So I'm going to repeat my previous step. I'm going to drop some of my airbrush cleaner in. I'm just going to do a quick clean down. In one of my previous videos we talked about doing a quick clean down and a full strip down. So I tend to do quick clean downs in between colour mixes on a day-to-day basis, and then I tend to, at the end of the session, so probably at the end of today's video, I will more than likely strip my airbrush completely down and clean it out fully, wipe the needle, lube it up with some needle juice, a little bit of lubrication on the needle, stops dry tipping, and there we have it. but in between colour changes, I just quickly just blow airbrush cleaner through it just to get the bulk of the colour out and reduce the problems we have. As soon as you start getting dry paint in your cup, then you start to have issues with your needles blocking and various other bits and bobs. But your airbrush will tell you when something's wrong. Okay, so that's the. Sorry?
Camera's gone.
The camera's gone?
Yeah, I can't see you. Check.
As far as I'm aware, everything's still running. Is that back again?
Not our end at the minute. Chaplain, are you able to see?
Yeah, I lost audio for a minute.
Right, I'm going to disconnect and then read.
Right. Okay. But you can both see the video okay at the moment, yeah?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
It's back now.
Welcome back. Okay. Okay, so we've got something a little bit different now. So we've got I'm going to be going with a Citadel colour. So these are slightly different. These are slightly different to your Vallejo colours. You can see straight away they come in the little pots. But I assure you they will mix in the airbrush just the same. So, but I actually mix these a little bit different. I've got here just a perfectly normal piece of plastic. You know, some of you that remember blister packs could use a bit of that. And all I'm going to do when I use the GW paints is get the paint, blob a bit of the colour onto that, and I'm basically using that as a little bit of a palette. Okay, and we'll close those because I have a habit of knocking them all over the place. So you could at this stage use your airbrush thinner if you wanted. You could also use with the GW paints a little bit of distilled water. So this is some distilled water I have in a little cup, and I pop that on there. So this is basically the same process. We are thinning the paint to the consistency of milk, but rather than doing it in the cup, we're actually doing it on this little piece of plastic. So this is also handy if you're wanting to get some super smooth transitions with your airbrush and you're mixing colours. So if you wanted, for argument's sake, to mix your colours, I know some of the YouTubers out there, certainly Angel Giraldez does this. He will mix two colours together on this pad, thin it to the consistency, and then he'll just drop it into his cup like so. He says, realising that there isn't a lot of room between the cup and the airbrush and the camera. So I've very simply just poured my paint in there. So all the thinning work that we did in the cup in the last with the last colours we've actually done on the plastic, but to the same consistencies. We're looking for that consistency of milk, and then we'll put it in the airbrush, and again I'm just going to test it on a piece of paper. You can see there we have it. A little bit, if I was looking at that, I'd say it's maybe a little bit too thin, but for this I think we'll get away with trigger control. If you decided, for argument's sake, that you didn't want to work round trigger control, in fact, let's do that. You could actually say, thicken your mix up. You could get a little bit of paint out your pot with your airbrush and just mix it in the bottom of the cup, and that would help thicken up the mix. I do always like to shut these because they do make a mess when you knock them over. So we can go back to our piece of paper, and we've got rid of that horrible spidering effect that we were getting by having it too thin. So rather than me trying to control it with the trigger, we've thickened the mixture up with a little bit of paint. If you'd found that you'd gone the other way and you thought it was too thin, you could either add thinners to the cup and mix it with a brush. If you thought that it was just a little bit too thick, you could maybe increase the pressure on your pressure regulator, and that would help blur it through as well, through your airbrush as well. So again, I'm just going to get my little pieces here off my bit of polystyrene. I'm going to try and get them out of the air blast shot. Get that out of our way. So as we did in the previous steps, I'm going to airbrush the blue over the edge of the purple, overlapping it slightly, allowing some of the blue to go onto the silver and some of it to go onto the purple, therefore hopefully looking like a bit of heat shimmer. Okay, I'm kind of liking the way this is looking. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking it could really do, that front edge could really do to be a little bit bluer. So what I've done is I've actually turning the edge that I want to look a bit more, have a bit more colour, away from me. I'm going to angle the airbrush from behind, and I'm going to hold the airbrush at a 45-degree angle, and what I'm trying to do is just catch that front edge a little bit more with the blue, and that angling it allows us to get the paint where we want it, and any overbrush won't cover that purple up, so we still get that purpley bluey transition. So hopefully you should be able to see that what I'm going for there. I'm quite happy with that. You know, it's again, I'll just do these other bits. You can see I'm just rotating the piece and playing the angles for the airbrush. Just to cover the pieces that we want. So I'm a big fan of this heat bloom. I think it's a lot easier to achieve the effect with an airbrush than it is through sort of washes. It's not impossible with washes. I've seen it done quite effectively too. Some very talented people out there. I just find it a lot quicker, simpler with the airbrush. So just got one more of these to do, and it's this big gum bit here. There we go. So again, I'm just rotating this and playing the angles a bit, holding the airbrush at an angle to catch the edges that I want. And then now I'm just going to blow a little bit of air at it just to dry it out for me. So hopefully should be able now to see that we've got this sort of brassy, bronzy, purple blue transition through the end of the gun, and that was what I was hoping to achieve. And I've managed to show you a couple of different ways on mixing the paint and thinning it. Again, I'm just cleaning my airbrush out, not too drastically, because like as I mentioned earlier, we're still working all with this on the same piece with the same colours. So if a little bit stays in the cup, it's not the end of the world. I'm not trying to clean this out pristine. I'm just trying to make sure that the paint, all the paint's out and the cup's dry, so it doesn't affect our thinning of the next colour. So if I just blow that out there, clean that out. So again, I'm just going to check it on my hand, make sure that it's just air that's coming out and there's no airbrush cleaner in there, and you can see there's bits of blue still in the cup, but I ain't too unduly worried. Okay, so the last step that I have for this this little bit of heat bloom effect is a black, and I'm just going to target the tips. So, and this is paint from the model Air Colour range. I'll bring it into shot a bit more. Okay, so I'm sure you'll have all seen these. You can get these certainly in the UK. You can get them at most hobby stores or Boyce's. Do a good range of Vallejo paints. You can also get hold of them fairly easily online. The air colour paints, they're designed, they say that they don't need thinning, and that you can put them straight in the airbrush and spray them. So historically, certain colours I've still added a drop of thinners, but I think I do think that the air colour can be put through without. So let's try that out. So I'm just going to drop that straight in the cup, nice and easy, no thinners, no mixing, no thinners, no nothing, straight in there, and let's have a look at what that comes out like. So you can see straight away there's very little spidering. I actually have to put quite a lot of paint on the piece of paper before we see any spidering at all. So yeah, you can put that straight in and airbrush it without any hassle thinning whatsoever. You will, however, get through a lot of paint. So all I'm doing now is I'm just trying to catch the tips of the barrels with this black. And again, I'm just using the angles to catch just the tips, because we don't want to overdo it and cover up all those nice transitions that we've put on. So the black just looks like there's just a little bit of soot on the end of the barrel, which is the effect I'm going for. You can see I'm just tapping that trigger, blasting away, just catching the edge that we were talking about. It looks a bit wet, so I'm just going to blast it with a bit of air. And actually, I've just turned that up there, and I don't know if you can see that, but the end of the barrel looks silver. So I'm just going to try and, I think that looks daft. So I'm just going to blast that, and just so it looks a bit more sensible. So I can actually feel in the airbrush that this paint's starting to thicken up a bit as it's coming through. So a couple of drops of thinner might help if you're going to be sitting and doing like a longer session with this colour. So I know I'm going to be spraying, airbrushing this for a couple of minutes, so it's not really going to affect me too much. But if you say you wanted to airbrush a bunch of marine black, you're doing some black Templars. Some of those new black Templar minis look amazing. You might want to just thin this down a bit, get you a bit more longevity of the paint in the cup. See, I can feel now that this is getting quite thick, so I'm just blasting it out on a piece of paper. So can you airbrush the airbrush paint straight out of the bottle? Yes, you can. But I think if you were going to be airbrushing for any length of time, or anything that's a little bit bigger than the pieces we're looking at today, I think I would I would certainly consider thinning that. Just a couple of drops, a couple of drops, not like earlier where we were filling the bottom of the cup with a bit of thinners. Certainly don't think you need that. I'd maybe put the paint in first and then just a drop of thinners in afterwards with the air paints. We don't seem to be doing too bad. This is the last bit, and again you can see I'm just having to push it on that paper because the paint's settling in the bottom of the cup and it's thickening up. And what happens, the danger of it thickening up is that it doesn't flow naturally through the airbrush and it builds up, and then a chunk of air, you have to pull the trigger back further than is actually necessary, and then all your paint comes out in a big splodge, and that will completely ruin the piece that you were trying to work on, which we don't want. So I guess we've not just looked at thinning paints today, but we've actually looked at a little bit of trigger control and how we deal with issues with the airbrush if we mix up our mix too thin or too thick. And you'll also see if your airbrush is spidering on your piece of paper, you know you're too thin. If it's thick and clumpy, it'll feel clumpy on the trigger. Now it's difficult for me to describe to you what the trigger feels like, but it will feel like, certainly if you've used your airbrush for any length of time, it will feel like you're actually having to draw that trigger back further than what you usually do. So again, it's what I said in the last video, you really need to get intimate with your airbrushes, get to using them, know how they feel. If you're uncomfortable airbrushing that really expensive model, just blast a piece of paper, draw loads of lines on a piece of paper and just get the feel of the airbrush and how you're mixing the paints. That's really the best advice I can give. So I think that for me that'll do for this evening. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now. No, right, no questions. Well, that's great. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll see you all in the next video.
That was awesome, guys. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you.